West Germany, 1986. A United States Senate hearing room. A police officer walks to the center of the room, carrying what looks like a knife. Standard grip, fixed blade, nothing unusual. He holds it up for the assembled senators to see. Then, he presses a button set into the handle. The blade leaves the handle entirely and crosses the room. The senators do not know what they are looking at, the officer explains. This weapon, he says, was developed by the Soviet Union for its special forces. The blade fires from the handle at 63 kilometers per hour. At close range, it can defeat body armor that stops a conventional bullet. Soviet special forces carry it strapped to the leg, issued to soldiers trained to slip into NATO territory before a war has officially begun. Senator Alphonse D'Amato of New York introduces a bill within weeks. The Ballistic Knife Prohibition Act passes later that year. It becomes federal law. Manufacturing, selling, importing, or transporting a ballistic knife across state lines in the United States is now a criminal offense. Consider that sequence again. One knife, one demonstration, one officer's testimony built on a defector's memoir that the Soviet Union had never confirmed or denied. Within a single legislative session, the American government had banned a weapon that almost none of its own citizens had ever seen, based on a description written by a man who had left the Soviet military 8 years earlier. The Soviet Union never said a word. What the ballistic knife actually was, how it worked, who carried it, and why the American government moved so fast to ban something it barely understood, is a stranger and more precise story than anything that Hearing Room heard that day. This is that story. To understand why anyone would build a knife that fires its own blade, you have to understand who was supposed to carry it and what they were supposed to do with it. Spetsnaz is a contraction of a Russian phrase meaning forces of special purpose. It is not one unit. It covers several different commands, but the branch that matters here is GRU Spetsnaz, brigades controlled by Soviet military intelligence, built around one specific wartime job. In a war against NATO, Spetsnaz units were never meant to fight at the front. They were meant to already be behind it. Soldiers would be inserted days or weeks before any declaration of war, moving in civilian clothes or captured uniforms, blending into the population of a NATO country that did not yet know it was at war. They would wait, and the moment hostilities began, they would move to destroy command and communication centres, to kill senior officers and officials, to sabotage fuel and ammunition depots, and to create chaos in the rear at the exact moment NATO needed every part of the alliance working in sync. Their existence was classified, their training was classified. Almost everything the West knew about them for decades came from one source: defectors. The most important of those defectors for this story was a GRU officer who left the Soviet Union for Britain in 1978 and published his account under the pen name Viktor Suvorov. His 1983 book on Spetsnaz gave Western readers their first detailed look at how these units trained, moved and fought, and buried inside it was a description of a knife. He described a Spetsnaz soldier carrying a large fixed blade knife on the right calf and 4 spare blades on the left. He described a spring mechanism inside the handle. Remove a safety catch, press a release button, and the blade shoots out with what he called a terrible hiss. He put the range at roughly 25 meters. He noted that if the blade struck a tree, it was sometimes impossible to pull back out. 25 meters. That is grenade throwing distance. Delivered by something that looks like an ordinary knife, makes almost no sound, and, unlike a gunshot, leaves no muzzle flash, no report, and no spent case for anyone to find afterward. That single passage from one book, written by one man who had been out of Soviet service for years, became the entire foundation for what the West believed about the ballistic knife. It still is. Strip away the mystique and the mechanism is not complicated. It is closer to a crossbow than a firearm. The blade does not extend forward the way a switchblade does. It separates completely from the handle. Inside a hollow cylindrical grip sits a steel spring held under heavy compression. The blade's tang, the metal shank, that on a normal knife sits fixed permanently inside the handle, instead slots into that spring assembly held in place by a locking catch. Press the release, and the spring unloads in a fraction of a second, driving the blade forward and clear of the handle. At that instant, the blade is no longer a knife. It is a projectile. It leaves the handle at roughly 63 kilometers per hour. And here is the detail. Almost nobody who marketed this weapon wanted to advertise. The blade has no fins, no spin, no aerodynamic stabilization of any kind. It is a flat piece of steel thrown through the air with nothing to keep it oriented point first. Past about 5 meters, it starts to tumble. It might strike a target point first, edge first or flat, and there is no way to control which once it has left the handle. That is not a design flaw. Soviet tactical doctrine accounted for it directly. The weapon was never built as a long-range tool. It was built for the same narrow window that Spetsnaz throwing knife training already covered, 5 or 6 paces, the distance just outside grappling range, where a soldier needs to eliminate a sentry before that sentry can raise an alarm. Inside 2 or 3 meters, tumble is barely a factor. The blade is essentially still travelling point first for the entire flight. Pressed against a target's body, it does not tumble at all. Picture the scenario the weapon was actually designed around. A Spetsnaz soldier is already inside NATO territory, in the opening hours of a war nobody at home has announced yet. There is a sentry standing between him and his objective. A rifle shot is too loud. Closing the last few meters by hand risks a struggle. And a struggle is not silent. The ballistic knife closes exactly that gap. The distance too far for a quiet kill by hand, too close to risk missing with a thrown blade. The blade separates. There is no gunshot. There is no casing on the ground. The operative retrieves the blade, reloads the spring, and keeps moving. If Cold War engineering like this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing costs nothing and tells the channel to keep making them. Now, how a weapon that barely existed in the West's field reports ended up on the floor of the United States Senate. Suvorov's description sat quietly in a specialist Cold War readership for the best part of a decade. What turned it into a household term was capitalism, not combat. Around 1982, American knife importers began bringing in commercially made spring, propelled ballistic knives manufactured by Eastern Bloc suppliers, and they marketed them almost entirely on the Soviet mystique attached to Suvorov's book. Advertising copy called them KGB assassination tools. Some catalogues claimed they were standard Spetsnaz issue, full stop, no qualification. None of that could be verified, all of it sold. By 1984, the ballistic knife was turning up in American martial arts magazines and self-defense catalogues, then in mainstream press coverage. 2 years later, it was on a table in a Senate hearing room, and within the same year, it was a federal crime to manufacture or sell one. The ban did something bans on obscure weapons tend to do. It made the thing famous. Before 1986, the ballistic knife was a footnote in one defector's memoir and a mail-order novelty. After 1986, it was a story every crime reporter and gun shop counter in America knew by name. A weapon this obscure, sold almost entirely on rumour, accumulated a matching set of myths. It is worth separating fact from marketing copy. The first myth is that every Spetsnaz soldier carried one. No confirmed document, Soviet or Western, supports this. Suvorov's account is the only detailed primary description that exists in the open literature, and Suvorov was describing training and equipment from a unit he had left years before publication. Whether it was standard issue across the army, a limited trial item, or something closer to a specialized prototype is not settled by any declassified source from any country to this day. The second myth is that it was accurate and lethal at 25 meters. The mechanism can physically send a blade that far. Whether it can hit anything useful that far is a different question. Past roughly 5 meters, the blade tumbles unpredictably. The tactical doctrine attached to it, and the entire reason it existed, assumed a target at 2 or 3 meters, not 25. The 25-meter figure describes maximum travel distance, not an effective engagement range, and Cold War era marketing quietly let readers assume those were the same thing. The third myth is that the Senate ban was based on hard intelligence. It was based on one police officer's demonstration and a passage from a memoir published by a man who had defected 8 years earlier. The Soviet government never confirmed the weapon's specifications, its issue rate, or even that Suvorov's description was accurate. American federal law was written, in effect, in response to a single unverified paragraph. The fourth myth is that it was the deadliest thing in a Spetsnaz soldier's kit. Soviet Special Forces doctrine relied far more heavily on things that never made a Senate hearing room, the trained throwing knife, accurate to 5 or 6 paces in a soldier's hand without any mechanism at all, and the standard issue infantry entrenching tool, which in trained hands became a thrown weapon accurate to roughly 8 meters, capable of killing with either the blade edge or the weight of the steel head. Neither needed a spring, a release catch, or a hollow handle. Neither ever generated a headline. Here is what can be said with confidence and what cannot. What is confirmed is this. Soviet defector literature describes a spring-loaded knife capable of firing its blade roughly 25 meters, intended for silent elimination of a target at very close range, as part of the equipment associated with GRU Spetsnaz training in the Cold War period. Commercial replicas based on that description entered the American market in the early 1980s and were banned by name under federal law in 1986. What is not confirmed by any declassified record from any country is that the weapon was ever standard issue across Spetsnaz brigades, that it was used operationally against a real target during the Cold War, or that the specifications Suvorov gave were verified by anyone other than Suvorov himself. The weapon the American government banned by name in 1986 may have existed almost entirely as Suvorov described it, a limited issue tool built for one narrow, terrifying scenario, a soldier already behind enemy lines, in the dark, with a sentry standing between him and a mission that officially was not happening. Or it may have been closer to a trial item, tested and never widely fielded, that a single memoir turned into Cold War legend on the strength of one striking passage. Either way, the law came first and the certainty never did. Congress banned a weapon on the word of a defector's memoir and a 15-minute demonstration. And 40 years later, no government has ever put a confirmed operational record next to that ban. The senators in that hearing room in 1986 thought they were looking at proof. What they were actually looking at was a knife, a spring, and a story. And the story was enough.